Hello, my name is Dr. Eric Landrum from the Department of Psychology at Boise State University, and this is my research method screencast on ethics. And wow, this is such a big topic and it involves so many moving parts. So, one of the things that you should have done before this course, probably in a prerequisite course, is taken the required city program training to be able to interact with human participants at Boise State. And that's a really good overview, regardless of your university, and with regard to the complexity of what ethical treatment and behaving ethically really means. And to be fair, even in this screencast, I'm going to give you a smattering, a little bit of a historical review and talk about some current practices and some, I wouldn't say debates, but I would say hot topics, at least at the time of this recording. And over time, one becomes an ethical researcher and looks to. So, ethics isn't something that you just pick up by watching a 30-minute screencast. It's much more complicated than that. But having said that, you got to start somewhere. So, let's go ahead and start. So, in the early 1960s, Stanley Milgram at Yale University was interested in studying the aftermath of World War II and Nazi concentration camps. And he was really interested in this notion of how could these soldiers have behaved in such a way that they led millions of people to death chambers, to their deaths. And was there something wrong with those people? Was that a relatively normal thing? We all want to believe that we would never harm anyone else and we could never kill someone else. So he was interested in that notion. And so he framed a series of studies that he did over decades, really, to look at this idea. And really, his interest was a study of obedience to authority. And you can see some of the details here. He did many studies. You can see in the right frame, there's a reproduction of one of the ads that was placed in a local paper. So if you showed up for the study of memory, you got $4 plus 50 cents cab fare. And so in 1963, New Haven, Connecticut. So it wasn't just limited to students, but he was really interested in people from across the community, not just aged 18 to 22. In fact, if you can peek at the ad there, I think it looks like ages 20 to 50. And so, actually, and it says high school and college students cannot be used. Interesting. So that was kind of the setup. And so, you really can't advertise the community, hey, I want to do a study on obedience to authority. And you really can't say, hey, if you were a guard at a Nazi concentration camp, would you kill people? I mean, that's not a question that people will probably answer um, completely truthfully, because clearly some people did do that during World War II. Yet, if we had asked them ahead of time, they probably would have said, no, I would never do that. So, anyway, so that's kind of the setup. And so this is a deceptive study. And so there was clearly deception. Participants are told that they're going to be part of a study on learning and memory, but it's really a study about obedience to authority. Now, when people were scheduled into the laboratory there at Yale, they were scheduled in pairs. And so they were showed up two at a time. And as the participants arrived, there was a scientist in a lab coat and another subject or participant. I'm actually going to show you some pictures from the time in a moment, but I want to stop it and pause here and say that when the pair of participants showed up for the study, only one was the real participant. The other one was in on the study. There's a term for that. That's called a confederate. So the Confederate acted like another subject, another participant, was curious about the study, showed up at the same time, knocked on the door, all that good stuff. But they were actually in on it. They were an actor, actress. They were what we call a Confederate. So the other person is going to be the person who's going to really be the person under study. All right, so here's just a couple of examples. And so there was a subject and there was a researcher. So the cover story was, we're doing a study on learning and memory. One of you is going to be the teacher, the other one's going to be the learner. We're going to draw slips of paper, and then we'll figure out who's going to be the teacher and the learner. Now that was rigged, and so the Confederate was always going to be the learner, and the true subject in the study was always going to be the teacher. So you can see in the left frame there, one subject was Mr. Wallace. He's the Confederate, so he's going to be the learner. He's getting strapped in there, and so he's going to he's in on the study. He's part of it. In the right frame, you can see an example of one of the real participants, and you can see he's sitting in front of what Stanley Milgram described as a shock machine. And again, I'm going to show you a close-up of this a little bit later. But the notion was going to be that the word pairs were going to be presented, and every time the learner made a mistake, a shock was going to be delivered. And the shock machine starts at 15 volts and it goes up to a maximum of 450 volts in 15-volt increments. And so it's kind of hard to see there, but those little white dots along the bottom of that machine are kind of the switches that are going to be flipped. All right, so that's kind of the setup, but I'm going to repeat this because I have more slides about this as well. So one subject was the learner, the other is the teacher. It's always rigged. Mr. Wallace is always going to be the learner. He's going to purposely make mistakes. And so, for example, there's going to be word pairs. And so if I have you memorize doctor and nurse, and then the teacher says doctor, the correct answer would be nurse. But Mr. Wallace is going to fake a memory problem and he's going to make a mistake on purpose. And the goal is the teacher should deliver an electric shock. Now, let's talk about this. And I actually showed you a picture of this where they attach electrodes to Mr. Wallace. Teacher goes to an adjacent room, and there were variations of that as time goes on, and we can come back to that later. The teacher sits in front of that shock machine. You saw that picture. The shock machine has the levels of shock labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts and 15-volt increments. And here's a different version of it with different lighting. So you can kind of see half the switches are switched up like there. And there's a little voltmeter. So it's a very, very persuasive display. Now, so let's be ultra clear about this. And so when the teacher is delivering shocks, no actual shocks are delivered to the learner, that is the Confederate, Mr. Wallace. However, Mr. Wallace is going to pretend, he's going to play. And so as the switches get flipped, he's going to express more and more pain. And so he's the actor in this study. So he might grimace and groan at first, and then he's going to get louder and louder. There actually are conditions of this study where he actually falls off the chair and you can't hear anything for a while. And the experimenters are encouraging the teacher to continue on with the study. There's a lot of depth and detail to this, and I'm actually giving it just a very quick overview. So one of the things that I need you to remember from this is that in the main portion of that study that I've described, no actual shocks were delivered. However, I want to be completely fair with you. You know, when they come in the door and they're getting oriented and they draw the slips of paper and you see, the learner getting strapped into the chair there, Mr. Wallace, they actually do a little test where they make sure the electrodes are working. And so there actually is a tiny little electric shock delivered to both of them just to show them both that the machine is working. So you're convincing the teacher and the learner, and it's really not about the learner, it's about the teacher, that there is shock there. But trust me, in the main portion of the study, no actual shocks were delivered. So, and what would that shock have been like? Do not do this at home, but if you were to lick the top of a 9-volt battery and complete that circuit, you'd get a little twinge. It wouldn't be dangerous typically, especially if you're not wearing a pacemaker. But it would be enough to convince someone that, oh, there is some shock there. Think about the kind of shock that you get. Static electricity, if you touch a doorknob or you've been walking on a carpet and you touch someone. So there was a shock. It was palpable, but it wasn't overly painful. Okay. So I hope you've got the setup of this now. And so the labels read from slight shock to moderate shock to danger, extreme shock. I think the very last label is marked with capital XXX. The learner is to learn these word pairs and is shocked on each mistake. So the teacher is trying to teach the word pair. But really, again, this study is not about teaching and learning. It's about obedience to authority. Because that white lab coat instructor in the room is with the teacher and say, no, please go ahead and go on. Please go ahead and go on. Please move along. So at 120 volts, Mr. Wallace begins screaming and wants out of the experiment. A lot of the teachers, the participants in the study, asked to stop, but the experimenter urges to continue. So the teacher in reality could stop at any time. All the experimenter used were verbal instructions. And so, in fact, they actually had a protocol what to say the first time the person wanted to stop, the second time, and so on. And so here's just another example of a different Confederate being strapped in. You can see the guy in the white lab coat. So they're checking it out there. They're checking out the equipment. You can see kind of the apparatus there. All right, so just a reminder, and I've said this 3 or 4 times, it's worth repeating. In the main portion of the study, no actual shocks were delivered. So the key question becomes, did anyone shock Mr. Wallace to the highest possible level? That would have been 30 mistakes at 15 volts apiece, up to 450. And again, remember at 120, he starts audibly reacting. Somewhere in the 300s, again, he's probably falling off the chair, and it takes him a couple minutes to recover. Now, again, remember, it's all pretend. He's the Confederate. He's the actor on this. And so the question was, would anyone shock Mr. Wallace to the highest possible level? This is somewhat parallel to that notion of, would guards in Nazi Germany, if told to kill millions of people, actually go through with it day by day? And we all want to say, no, of course not. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't take innocent people to their deaths. And in the experimental version of that for Milgram, it would be, no, of course not. Of course, I wouldn't shock anyone to the highest possible level, 450 volts. Well, as you can imagine, and perhaps you already understand from popular culture, the answer is yeah. About 60% across many of the studies. In this particular version in 1963, 25 out of 40, or 62.5%, delivered the full voltage. And this was fascinating to Milgram. And by the way, over the course of the following decades, he replicated this with males and females, different nationalities, different ethnicities, different cultures, races, religious affiliations, and it does vary. So the percentage is not always going to be in the 60s in terms of 60% the full voltage. But my recollection of this is that there was never a case where any group all unanimously refused to deliver the full amount of shock. And so the only thing varying here is the percent of people within the experimental condition which did or did not deliver the full amount of shock. And this is kind of surprising because this guy's acting, he's falling off the chair. He's pretty good at what he was doing. And so again, it's this study about obedience to authority. Now, big, huge ethical things to think about here. It's a really great and rich case study to talk about stress and psychological harm. So clearly there would have been physical harm. That's obvious if shocks were delivered. And other than that little warm up to show them the equipment was working, again, no actual shocks were delivered. But clearly the issue here is psychological harm. So imagine if you had been the teacher in that study and you have shocked someone to 450 volts and you don't hear anybody moving, and they say, okay, the study's over. Here's your $4.50. Have a nice day. Can you imagine the thoughts that person might have later that evening? Oh my God, what did I do? I just shocked someone 30 times in a study, and I'm not even sure if they're okay or not. All right. Now, that's actually not how the experiment plays out, so don't worry about that. But I want you to realize that, even if the actual shocks weren't delivered, the psychological harm here is vast with regards to how the teacher might feel about himself or herself, the anxiety over the procedures. Now, as it turns out, there was something called debriefing. That is, before the participant was allowed to leave the laboratory with their $4.50, Mr. Wallace comes out. They explain the study that he was acting. There was no actual harm. And the participant, the learner, doesn't have to feel bad that they shocked someone 30 times. Although they flipped the switch 30 times, no actual shocks were delivered. And so you want to make sure that you minimize any potential detriments to the deception that was used in the study. Again, you really can't come out in this study and say, hey, would you shock someone 30 times if they made 30 mistakes? Odds are people would say no, but in fact, almost 2/3 do that in an actual research scenario. And also, and I'm going to get to this in a moment, Milgram was very good about long-term follow-up. He actually had some cool predictions made ahead of time, a priori, and we'll come up to those here eventually. So this is clearly a case of a deceptive study, and I think it's one of these situations, especially for topics in social psychology, where deception, if you're going to get at true behaviors, deception is probably warranted, although it has to be very carefully handled because there are thick ethical considerations to be thought about here because we have to weigh the potential of harm against the potential of what we learned from such a study, the behavioral insight versus the potential for harm. And so it's not a study about learning and memory, it's actually an obedience to authority study. So in this kind of study and studies like it, participants lack what's called informed consent. And so ideally, if we can do it in a study and get a true test of our hypothesis, we like to tell people what they're signing up for. So the subject, that participant, is given an accurate perception of the risks involved before consenting to participate in an experiment. So for instance, if you've taken an online study as maybe part of a research requirement for introductory psychology. There's probably a consent form that if you were in person, you would sign it. If you're online, you're going to click a button that says something to the effect of, yes, I consent to participate in this study. So in the situations where we can accomplish this, we really would prefer to offer and gain informed consent as opposed to using deceptive practices. And here's an example. People when they first get exposed to this, they say, "Well, how rude! I mean, how could you possibly do this to another human being?" Well, remember, first off, Milgram wanted insights from the real scenario during World War II, but I think this is a nice example of what had Milgram used these instructions, and I'll let you read these. So, if I were to ask you to fill out a test about your fascist tendencies because we think there's a relationship between that and obedience to authority, you can imagine, really, I mean, raise your hand if you're a fascist. Not a lot of people are going to admit to that. And so it's one thing to ask people how they would act, it's different to ask them to act. And in fact, we're going to come back and talk about simulation and role playing in a couple of minutes, and even how sometimes those studies can go awry. So informed consent is ideally designed to eliminate or hopefully minimize the problem of deception. And to be honest with you, I'm not so sure I can say the vast majority, but many, many studies in psychology don't need to use deception. And so if you're really doing a study about learning and memory, you tell people, I'm doing a study about learning and memory. I want you to memorize this list of words, and in 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to recall it. There's no need for deception there. You're telling the person what to do and what's expected. And so in many areas of psychology, deception is really not an issue at all with regards to experimentation. The problem is that in some sensitive areas, and those tend to be in social psychology, I think for the most part, although if you're doing studies on motivation and emotion, it can be there too. The problem is that you don't want informed consent to change the participant's behavior. In other words, you don't want people to behave differently because they know they're in a study. Now, Milgram's folks knew they were in a study, but they thought they were in one study when they were actually in a different study. And so we want people to act normally and naturally when they're participating in a research experiment. We would ideally not like them to change their behavior. So if the informed consent might change the way you act or change your opinions about something, that becomes a self-selection problem because maybe you select out of the study. Maybe you hear, oh, there's a study about X going on. I really want to be part of that study. And you don't want people actively selecting in or selecting out of the study because of the topic or informed consent. And so if you can avoid that, it's a good problem to avoid. And one solution, or at least way to minimize that impact of informed consent, is that debriefing I talked about earlier, where you instruct participants about the experiment after it's been completed. So for instance, in Milgram studies, they didn't let the learner go and say, bye-bye, have a great day. They didn't let the teacher go. They brought out Mr. Wallace. They introduced them to reintroduced them to the Confederate, but told them that in this case they were Confederate, and then they made sure that the teacher understood that all the responses were fake and all the groans of pain and falling on the floor, that was just play acting. And so that person might still feel bad about flipping the switch to 450 volts, but at least they know that no one was harmed on the other side of the wall. And in fact, Milgram did a very nice job making sure there was no long-term harm after his study was over. He did a really, really good job with that. So Milgram told participants the behavior was normal, assured them there was no actual shock. Mr. Wallace comes back out. They had already met at the beginning, now they meet again at the end. Milgram followed up with his participants, and here's the results from one of those studies in the early 1960s. 84% said they were glad they participated, 74% say they benefited from the experience, and only 1% were sorry they had participated. That's pretty amazing. And so even the participants, it seems, most of them had a pretty good experience and 99% were not sorry that they had participated in the study. So this is kind of interesting. And there's two parts of this. For Milgram's study, when they were interviewed 1 year later by a psychiatrist, there were no ill effects present. Okay, so there was no long-term harm, and that's the point here on the left side. On the right side, I've got a snapshot of the cover page from a study that was published in 2009 in the experimental. It was in the American Psychologist, called "Replicating Milgram: Would People Still Obey Today?" And Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University did this really cool study. It actually got some TV press coverage, and they didn't do the full replication of Milgram, but did a partial replication. And what they found was that the pattern of results were pretty similar. And so we might think, oh yeah, in the 60s, those people would shock people to 450 volts. Well, in very similar scenarios that Berger studied in 2009, people were still going the whole way. There wasn't a lot of difference. And so we really can't sit back and go and say 30 years later, 50 years later, oh no, we would never do that. There's a component of human nature about obedience to authority, and it may change slightly over time and over populations and religiosity and ethnicities and backgrounds and cultures, but there are still basic tenets about obedience to authority that are still present with us today. So for us to say we would never do that individually, that may make a lot of sense, but as a group, as a culture, that's actually really not the case, as evidenced by the data. So, you can see that deception's pretty dramatic, and it could have some long-term negative effects, but Milgram was pretty good about following up on that. And so other researchers have encouraged role-playing. And so rather than, putting them in the situation of teacher and learner, asking people, how would you react in this situation? And so although that is probably a safer and obviously less deceptive method, it still has problems, and there have still been studies that had problems with simulation and role playing. The famous one is the Stanford prison study, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to come back to this, and it may be on a future slide, but one last piece about the Milgram study. Stanley Milgram, before he did these epic classic studies, convened a group of psychiatrists. And he asked this, and he described this study and the experiment, and he asked the psychiatrist to what percentage of the population I'm going to test will shock to the highest level, 450 volts. And I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, the psychiatrist on average said about 1% or less than 1%. Only psychopaths and sociopaths are really going to shock people all the way 30 times to 450 volts. Well, as it turns out, you already know the results here. In the study I presented to you, 62.5%. So, if we had just relied on the psychiatrist's expert opinion, we wouldn't have this huge insight into obedience to authority that we do today because of studies like Milgram's career studies, Jerry Berger's study in 2009, and so on. But role-playing is an honest alternative to deception. Sometimes one of the knocks on this, one of the drawbacks might be that, if I'm asking you to role play, that's really not the same thing as being in that situation. It's kind of the thing about, I could ask you, if there was someone stranded on the side of the road and they were changing a tire, would you stop to help them? And many of us would say, yeah, we would. But if we were actually in that situation, would we actually stop to help them? That's the rub right there. And so, is what we say would we do different than what we would really do? And that's an important distinction for psychologists who want to understand human behavior. So there it is right there. The most serious threat is that we worry that the results would be different if you were in the real situation as opposed to the role playing or the simulation. So it's really hard to predict some of these really core concepts from social psychology like obedience, aggression, altruism, conformity. It's really difficult to think about how would we act if we were in that situation as compared to how we do act in that situation. And there's the reminder about the group of psychiatrists. None of the psychiatrists had actually predicted 60% or more. And I do think the average was around 1% or less than 1% of the psychiatrists thought that participants would go all the way to 450 volts. So I want to talk about probably the most famous alternative to deception or simulation studies. And I know the pictures are confusing. I'll get to that in a minute. So in simulation studies, you try to simulate real world situations. And the classic Zimbardo 1973 Stanford prison study is a great example of this. And you've got a little bit of a bullet there. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but Phil Zimbardo at Stanford University recruited participants to be in a 2-week study. Folks were randomly assigned to either guards or prisoners. Everyone was going to be paid $15 a day. They were going to be housed in the basement of the psychology building there at Stanford. And you can see an example in the left frame there at the bottom. Guards were given guard gear, prisoners were given prison gear. You can see on the right where I visited a couple of years ago, there's a little plaque there that commemorates the classic Stanford prison study, and I posed next to that plaque. And so, but the notion was, we're just going to do this pretend study about, and we're going to simulate a prison. We're not going to put people in prison. But Zimbardo did a pretty good job here. He actually got Palo Alto police to actually be in on it, and the people who agreed to be in the study got arrested if they were going to be in the prisoner condition. So they got arrested, they got handcuffed, they were brought to the psychology building. The guards were there, they uncuffed them, they put them in cells. They actually removed doors from the lab in the basement of this building and put in metal cells. And so it was very realistic, but it wasn't a real jail. However, after 6 days, it got kind of violent, and people really adopted the roles of prisoners and guards. And so it's really a fascinating case study about human behavior and even the difficulties in experimentation. It's pretty interesting. And if you want to get into that, there's all kinds of websites and books. And in fact, there was a movie that came out in 2015 that's actually devoted to that topic and kind of recreates that. So another set of alternatives to deception are honest experiments. And I think it's fair to say this is the bulk of what psychologists do in terms of research, where, participants are made completely aware of the purposes of the research. If you're in a learning and memory study, I'm just going to tell you you're in a learning and memory study. If you're in a study where I want to ask you your attitudes about graduate admissions, there's no need to hide that. I'm interested in your attitudes about graduate admissions. And so that is, maybe the cleanest and best alternative to deception, especially when it works with the topic that you're studying. This also can work with explicit programs designed to change behavior and field experiments. If you're just going out and observing and watching, there's really not a lot of deception that needs to take place there. Naturally occurring events as well. And so all kinds of times we see whether it's a natural disaster or something happens, psychologists jump into the field to try to, measure behavior, collect behavior, try to observe what's going on in a systematic fashion. So, and I think I've already alluded to this. So, in many of the areas of psychology, deception is not really a big deal, but it could be a bigger deal if you're a social psychologist, you're studying motivation and emotion. Sometimes, the issue becomes, if I tell you what I'm studying, will that change your behavior? And if the answer is yes, then we've got to think about deception, or at least practices that can let us get at a true assessment of what we're interested in regarding human behavior. I do want to mention a couple other ethical issues as we start to wrap up this screencast. we're going to be always going to be concerned about privacy and confidentiality. We want to keep people's responses private. That is, that we're going to keep them so where their names are not identified with their data. If I want to do that, I have to get special permissions from each participant. I'm going to keep the individual results confidential. I might share it with my research team, my research assistants, but almost always we're reporting data in an aggregate. So I'm reporting a group mean and a group standard deviation. I'm not, you know, Personally, I'm a nomothetic researcher, not an idiographic researcher. So I'm interested in reporting group scores and group averages and a correlation between two variables based on a group. I'm not really that interested in the individuals per se, but to look at larger trends to be able to make generalizations. And so, but as ethical researchers, we have to be careful to protect both privacy and confidentiality. We've got to be careful about responses in sensitive areas need to be anonymous and confidential. Observations in public versus private. There is an expectation of privacy. We have to follow those rules and laws in the United States just like anybody else. Uh, you know, can you go and pick up someone's trash if it's on the street corner compared to whether it's on the driveway? Can you do observations in public bathrooms, the amount of time someone spends washing their hands, or do they use soap or not? I mean, these are ethical issues that we have to deal with that involve not only privacy and confidentiality, but also observations and expectations of privacy. And so we can study really important topics, but it can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. We also have special protections for special subject populations. So, anyone who's under 17 years of age, we need extra protections because they are minors. They are not consenting adults. In fact, the term is they cannot provide informed consent, but they can only provide assent, and then you get informed consent from the parent or guardian. So if you want to do research on third and fourth graders, that could be a great topic, but there's going to be multiple layers. Not only do the children have to agree, but the teacher and the superintendent of the school and the school district and the parents, and so sometimes those studies take much longer to accomplish because there are extra protections in place. That same thing happens for mental patients and prisoners. For example, when I was doing, that eons ago work with Alzheimer's disease patients, I actually, Alzheimer's patients can't give their own consent. I had to find the guardian, the next of kin, and ask for his or her consent to work with their mother, their grandmother in that situation. And so there are certain, even though people are prisoners, that doesn't mean that psychologists get to do whatever they want. And so they're a protected population with regards to experimentation. And and this is an important point. We cannot withhold beneficial treatment. So if we're doing a therapy study where there's a treatment group and a control group, and we figure out that some new flavor of cognitive behavior therapy is actually quite beneficial to people going through post-traumatic stress disorder and experiencing those symptoms, as soon as the study is over and we know there's a beneficial treatment, we then turn to the control group and say, we are offering this to you as part of your participation in the study. Would you like to participate? And so we don't withhold beneficial treatments. We will, to be fair, we will delay them. By the same token, actually, it's actually not the same token, it's the flip side of that token. If we did a study and we found that there were negative effects of the new therapeutic intervention, we would not offer those to the control group, and we would offer to the experimental group anything that we could do to help ameliorate, help make those negative effects go away. So if we do harm by accident, we are obligation to try to correct that harm as best we can. If we discover a beneficial treatment, we are bound by ethical principles to offer that beneficial treatment to the control group. So it's not withheld. In this case, it's delayed. I really just want to close out this screencast by talking about a couple of really current concerns. They're big and they're broad and they're complicated, but I think as a student in research methods, you should at least know of them. And if you want to explore more deeply, we can do that during the course. But during 2005, there was a report issued, and it's typically called the Hoffman Report because that's the lead attorney on the cover sheet that you see here, about an investigation into the behavior of psychologists with regards to terrorism and interrogations of folks in terrorist situations, and also the policies of the American Psychological Association. And again, this is big and broad and complicated, but what this finding reported was that there were huge violations with regard to APA policies on ethics, as well as it looks like there was collusion between certain members of the American Psychological Association and the military slash legal community on interrogation techniques that were allowed to be used. And so this is a huge concern. It has not gone away. There were, we tend to want to say do no harm. It's oftentimes more complicated than that. We want to do as little harm as possible, yet preserve the balance the interests of individuals versus society. And so you should just know that, even today, teachers and researchers and practitioners are dealing with and grappling with these ethical issues. And when you're on the ground in the middle of it, you might think you're doing something right, but after reflecting on it in a larger context, you might realize that that was not the appropriate course of action. And so I just wanted you to be aware of that. In fact, APA, to their credit, has admitted that mistakes were made, and they were by us, and that we are going to change our ways. And I think it's really a matter that they have to. Any discipline, any set of professionals needs to have the respect and trust of the community. And so if you can't trust a psychologist to act in your best interest, then there's going to be a huge issue with trusting the discipline of psychology. And here's a screenshot of something from the APA website. Again, if you just get onto Google and search on Hoffman Report or APA, you'll find probably tens of thousands of hits by now with regard to these critical issues that are going on in American psychology. One other issue I think it's really worth mentioning briefly here, and I've talked about it in a couple of other screencasts, is that also in 2015, a set of researchers reported about replications, replicability, trying to reproduce prior results from studies. And there was a team that looked at 100 studies, and they asked people around the world, actually, I think, not just in the nation, but around the world, would you please replicate this study as close as you can to exactly how it was described in the methods section with regard to participants, materials, and procedure. And over the course of a number of years, what happened was that, out of those 100 studies, only, I believe it's 36. I think that's 36% of the replications were successful. And so again, that's a good news, bad news thing. The good news is, wow, at least psychology can take, a mirror and look at itself pretty carefully and look at our practices. But the bad news is, wow, only 36 out of 100 these studies actually replicated. And if you dig deeper into this, and I'm showing you a couple screenshots here of where you can dig deeper into it, you'll find things like, in some of those 100 studies that were published, the results were relatively small. We talked about effect size in a different screencast. And so, if you had small effect sizes that got into the literature, by the time those were replicated, some of those weren't present. Those studies that had robust, large effect sizes tended to replicate. And sometimes a failure to replicate, that doesn't imply fraud. That just implies that the phenomenon may not be as robust as we think it is. And so this isn't about fraud per se. It's about, best practices for the characteristics of good science. That we have this old saying, if it hasn't happened twice, it hasn't happened. Well, in some of these studies, maybe we need to think about that the exact same way. If we haven't gotten the same pattern of results in at least 2 different studies, that might call into question just the tenacity of the results from the first study. And so that's another huge issue going on in 2015 as well. And I'm sure that debate and discussion will continue for years to come. All right, that's it for me and this screencast.